Hi, I'm Rebecca Kemp Brent. I'm one of those people who's kind of always enjoyed dress up, so I have a skirt to show you today that can be just about anything you want it to be. I've made an Elizabethan quilted underskirt out of satin, and I'm going to show you how to make the skirt pattern as well as how to do the quilting. This is meant to be a costume sort of skirt rather than a historic reproduction. And because I've quilted the skirt, it has a little extra body you can see that helps it stand out away from your legs. And big plus about that is when you're not doing reproduction work, you don't have to do some kind of a cumbersome understructure or wear hoops under it. Instead, you wear this quilted underskirt and then you put an overskirt on top, which can be a lighter weight fabric that will fall open at the front and show this pattern of tapered quilting that I've made down the skirt. You also can use the same pattern to fit any body, and you can even make something like a superhero's cape out of it if you want to. The other thing that I wanted to talk with you about today is about taking quilting off the bed and using some fabrics other than quilting cottons. You can see there and here that I've used a satin as my face fabric. I think that the satin with a flannel backing would make a really super, very special baby blanket. And if you're fond of costume dramas, then you've probably seen quilting on a lot of different materials, maybe leather or faux leather or velvet. So the sky's kind of the limit, and especially when you're doing costume. The skirt pattern that I'm going to show you is a half circle. It's one of my favorite skirt patterns and was my go-to skirt pattern for a number of years. So I've actually made the skirt in a lot of different fabrics. When I do the quilting on the satin, I'm going to choose a trilobal polyester quilting thread, and you can see it has a really nice sheen to it, which goes so well with the satin fabric. In addition, a polyester thread has a lot of strength to it, and the thing about a circle skirt or a half circle skirt is that some of the drape in the skirt is going to be on the bias, and you can imagine that that's going to tug a little bit at the stitching, so that extra strength of the polyester thread can help your quilting stitches stay in place. There is a little bit of math, but if you'll go to itssoeasytv.com, you'll find a download that has this chart where all you'll have to do is take a couple of measurements and fill in the blanks. Then you can use a calculator for the arithmetic. The two measurements that you'll need are your waist and the length of the skirt from your waist to wherever you want the hemline to fall. In this case, that's just a little bit above the floor, but you can vary that, and that's why this is a great pattern for any body. Even a child's skirt is easy to make just using the measurements of the person who's going to be wearing the costume. To make your pattern and calculate how much fabric you'll need, you put in those measurements. So we're going to have the waist measurement and the length from the waist to the hem. And then you use that to make this half circle. You'll notice at one point in the calculations that you multiply that waist length by 2. That doesn't mean it's going to be twice as big as your waist. My skirt's gathered a little bit on the mannequin because she's smaller than I am. And you can certainly make your waist with some gathers if you like. But the reason we multiply the waist by 2 is because we're only using half of that complete circle. Then you know how much fabric you need to buy, and in addition, you should get 1/8 or 1/4 of a yard more, and that's going to allow the fabric that you need to cut out your waistband. You'll notice that there's some waist fabric outside the circle. My model is made with a binding around the hem instead of turning up a hem. And these waist areas will generally give you enough fabric to cut the bias strips that you need to make that binding. I've lined my skirt with plain muslin, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One is muslin's very inexpensive, and it's not going to be visible in the skirt anyway. You could certainly use a matching color cotton if you prefer. I've also chosen cotton for the interior in the hope that it will cut down on that static electricity that you'd expect to have trouble with if you were just wearing a polyester satin skirt. You may find, depending on how tall you are, that your fabric isn't quite wide enough to accommodate this whole half circle. So you'll need to do a little piecing. And if that happens, this is the way I recommend you piece your fabric. It puts the piecing seams toward the back of the skirt where they're not as visible. And you'll also see this little sort of split between these two pieces of extra fabric. That's so, let's say this is 120 inches of fabric to make my skirt. Instead of having to buy another 120-inch length, I can buy half as much, just 60 inches. And then I split that lengthwise, and it gives me two pieces so I can piece my skirt fabric a little more economically. Now, once the skirt's made, and all the instructions for that will be on the website, then I'm going to do the decorative quilting on it. And this is a schematic that just shows you what I had in my head while I was designing this. I want it to be wider at the bottom than it is at the top, so I'm thinking of each motif in my quilting as a square. You don't actually have to mark all those squares on your fabric. Instead, what I do is imagine the shaded squares, but I just mark some of the corners, and that cuts down a little bit on the marking that you do on your actual skirt fabric. And if you'll come with me over to the frame, I'll show you why I like to cut down on the marking, but I'll also show you how to put this quilting onto your skirt. Okay, if you can see my fabric here around the edges, where I've marked around the edges of my quilting motif, you'll see that I have fuzzy lines that are kind of thick, and that's because depending on your fabric and depending on the marker you use, that can happen. So that's one of the reasons that I like to cut down on the number of marks that I put on my fabric. The other reason, I don't know if you can even see it here, but sometimes the marks don't want to come out completely, especially in the beginning. The best trick I can give you for that, if it's a water-soluble marker, is that you want to use a lot of plain water with no other soaps or chemicals in it. So I'm not going to worry too much about the extra marks on my fabric right now, because when the skirt's completely finished, I'll put it in the wash and let all of that ink wash out. Okay, now let's talk about how we're going to put together our tapered quilting design. And you might be surprised to know that this is actually one of the easiest quilting designs that I've done in a long time. And the reason is that we're just going to do one motif at a time. So in my software, I'm going to find one that I like. This one looks sort of Elizabethan. Now I'm going to go to my settings screen, where I can choose my placement method, and I want 4 points, and under the fill method, I'm going to choose stretch. What that does is tell the software that I'm going to give it 4 corner points for my motif, and then it will stretch the design to make it fit inside those 4 points, whether or not it's actually a square. So for my first motif, I have a 10-inch baseline. The next square was 9 inches, so at the top it's narrower. It's only 9 inches across. And then at the next one, it's just 8 inches across. I've sewn out the first motif, and once I've done that, then I'm going to use the actual stitching to give me the point for locating the next block. And that's the best way to be sure that your stitches will line up from one to the next. Then you move around the square. I'm going to use the 8-inch width, so I'm tapering in the top of this square. And I just keep going until I have told the program where all 4 of those corners lie. Then we're ready to pull up the bobbin thread. And you may remember that on your screen, you'll get this little message, please ensure that the needle is up. You can take that message off the screen or whatever warnings that your software may give you, but I like to leave them in place just in case this is the day I'm a little absent-minded. Then after I pull up that bobbin thread, I'm ready to touch sew and sit back and let the machine do the work for me. And what I looked for when I was choosing a motif is one that doesn't have a lot of internal stitching, because I want to let the puffiness come through. I like the texture of the quilting in my skirt. But I've also chosen something that has definite corner points, and that's because even though the size of my blocks is not the same, this one's 10 inches by 9 inches, this one's 9 inches by 8 inches, even with that variation, those corner points are going to line up beautifully, and so it's going to look like one continuous design up the center front of my skirt. When I have all of the tapered designs done, then I'll reposition the fabric in the hoop, and I'm going to put a few additional quilting motifs along each side that sort of look like a lace edging, a nice wide lace alongside these center points. We're almost around. And then the machine's going to tie off and tell me that it's finished. And when it's all done, it will let me go back to the placement screen. Then I can take a minute and show you really quickly how I put together those edging motifs. Okay, we're going back to pattern placement, and this time I want to use two motifs together. And the width and length that you put on these doesn't matter as much, because we're actually going to change that again the way we did just now. So I'm just going to start with 4 as an easy place to start, and I'm going to tell it that I'll have 2 patterns that are 4 by 4. Then we go in and select a pattern, this time from the continuous line area, and find one that will join up and give me this sort of lacy look. Now you can see I have 2 of these together, and then I'll use my software to make sure that those connect, and once I do, then I'm ready to use the same placement technique, 4 corners and stretch, and my 4 corners will start at the edges of the embroidery I've already done. So this is a really super way to make a costume skirt that's suggestive of the olden days. But I also think that the tapered quilting would be a super way to finish something like a Christmas tree skirt, or maybe a round table topper. So there are lots of possibilities here, and I hope that this will encourage you to let your inner costume come out and have some fun with your sewing and quilting patterns, even if they don't belong on your bed.